Now that your husband is dead, leave and never come back, my daughter-in-law said, her voice steady, almost casual, as if she were asking me to pass the salt instead of erasing me from my own life. I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her right away. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the faint tremble in my fingers, the kind that comes not from weakness, but from something breaking quietly inside you. The dining room was still set the way I had arranged it that morning, the good china laid out, the silverware polished, the centerpiece of white lilies I had picked because they were Robert's favorite. It had only been 7 days since we buried him. 7 days since I stood beside his grave in the cold November air, watching 38 years of marriage lowered into the ground. And now I was sitting at the same table we had shared for decades, being told I no longer belonged. Did you hear me? Jessica added, her tone sharpening just slightly, like a blade being turned. I lifted my eyes then, slowly meeting hers. There was no hesitation in her expression, no trace of discomfort, just certainty. Beside her, my son Daniel stared down at his plate, pushing a piece of chicken around with his fork as if it required all his concentration. He didn't look at me. Not once. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I nodded once, a small movement that seemed to surprise her more than any protest would have. Then I reached for my napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my plate. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second stretching longer than it should. All right, I said quietly, my voice steady, almost calm. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor, a sound that felt too loud in the stillness that followed. No one stopped me, not even my son. I walked down the hallway slowly, my steps measured, passing the framed photographs that lined the walls. There was Daniel at 8 years old, missing his front tooth, smiling up at me. There was Robert, his arm around my shoulders at our 20th anniversary, his eyes full of the kind of warmth that made you feel safe without a single word. Paused for half a second in front of that photo, just long enough to feel the weight of it, then kept moving. In our bedroom, everything was exactly the way I had left it that morning. Robert's watch sat on the dresser. His reading glasses rested on the nightstand. The bed was still slightly unmade on his side, as if he might walk back in and lie down at any moment. I didn't cry. I didn't reach for anything. I simply picked up my purse, the same one I had carried for years, and checked inside it with quiet precision. Wallet, keys, phone, everything I needed. I walked back through the house without looking into the dining room again. I didn't need to see their faces. I already knew what they looked like. The front door opened with a familiar creak, the cool air outside brushing against my skin as I stepped onto the porch. It was late afternoon, the kind of gray light that makes everything feel suspended between day and night. I closed the door behind me gently, making sure it didn't slam. I had lived in that house for over 3 decades. I wasn't going to leave it with noise. I walked down the driveway at a steady pace, each step deliberate, my heels clicking softly against the concrete. I didn't look back. Not once. By the time I reached my car, the trembling in my hands had stopped. In its place was something else. Something quieter. Colder. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring straight ahead at the empty street, letting the silence settle around me. Then I started the engine. The sound filled the space, grounding me. I pulled out of the driveway without hesitation, turning onto the main road as if I had somewhere specific to be. And in a way I did. I didn't go to a friend's house. I didn't go to a hotel. Instead, I drove straight to the bank Robert and I had used for years, the one on Maple Avenue with the tall glass windows and the polished floors that always smelled faintly of coffee and paper. It was nearly closing time when I walked in, but I knew they would still be there. They always were. The receptionist looked up and smiled politely, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes when she saw me. "Mrs. Hayes," she said gently, her voice lowering just slightly as if she remembered. Of course she did. Everyone remembered the man who had come in every Friday for the past 20 years, always with a quiet joke and a kind word. "I need to speak with Mr. Collins," I said. My voice didn't waver. Not even a little. She nodded immediately, picking up the phone without asking any questions. As I stood there waiting, I glanced at my reflection in the glass wall across the lobby. A 71-year-old woman stared back at me, her silver hair neatly in place, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. Then I did. And I realized something important. Jessica thought she had sent me away. She thought she had ended something. But as I stood there in that quiet bank, with the weight of Robert's absence still pressing against my chest, I understood that she hadn't ended anything at all. She had only started something she didn't yet understand. I followed the receptionist down the quiet hallway, the soft hum of overhead lights filling the silence between my footsteps, and with each step I felt something inside me settling into place, not peace, not yet, but clarity, the kind that comes when illusions fall away and there is nothing left to misunderstand. Mr. Collins was already standing when I entered his office, his expression shifting the moment he saw me, recognition first, then something gentler, something respectful. He had known. Robert for years had sat across from him at that same desk more times than I could count, discussing numbers, signatures, plans for a future that had always included me. "Margaret," he said quietly, motioning for me to sit. I lowered myself into the chair across from him, placing my purse carefully on my lap, my hands resting on top of it, still and composed. "I am sorry for your loss," he added, and for a brief moment, the words hung in the air between us, heavy but familiar. I nodded once, acknowledging them without letting them pull me under. "I need to review everything Robert put in place," I said, my voice steady, direct. He did not ask what I meant, he simply nodded, reaching for a folder already sitting on the corner of his desk as if he had been expecting this moment long before I arrived, as if Robert himself had anticipated it. "Your husband was very thorough," he said, opening the folder and sliding a stack of documents toward me. The pages were crisp, neatly organized, each one marked with tabs and signatures, the kind of order Robert had always preferred. I looked down at them, not rushing, not skimming, but taking in each detail with quiet attention. Names, dates, account numbers, legal language that once would have felt overwhelming now felt precise, almost reassuring, like a map drawn by someone who knew exactly where every path would lead. "There are specific instructions here," Mr. Collins continued, his tone measured. "Contingencies, protections, conditions tied to certain behaviors." I lifted my eyes to meet his, and in that moment something unspoken passed between us. He knew, or at least he suspected, that something had already happened, that I was not sitting in that chair simply out of routine. "What kind of conditions?" I asked, and he paused briefly before answering, choosing his words with care. "Your husband wanted to ensure that you would never be placed in a vulnerable position, not financially, not legally, and not within your own home." The last part settled deeper than the rest, "not within your own home." I let that phrase sit in my mind for a moment before lowering my gaze back to the documents. I turned a page. Slowly, then another, until I found what I did not know I had been looking for until it was there in front of me, a clause written in clear, unmistakable language outlining ownership, authority, and the conditions under which that authority could shift. It was not complicated, not hidden behind layers of confusion. It was direct, intentional, unmistakable. I read it once, then again, letting the meaning settle fully, not rushing past it, not softening it, just seeing it for what it was. And as I did, I felt something inside me change, not a surge of anger, not a rush of emotion, but a quiet alignment, like a door closing behind me and another opening ahead. "He trusted you," Mr. Collins said softly, and I almost smiled at that, not because it comforted me, but because it confirmed what I already knew. Robert had not been a man who left things to chance. He had seen more than he said, understood more than he showed, and he had prepared accordingly. I closed the folder gently, placing my hand flat on top of it for a moment before looking back up. "I will need copies of everything," I said, and Mr. Collins nodded without hesitation, already reaching for the printer. As the machine began its quiet work, I leaned back slightly in the chair, allowing myself a single, measured breath. Outside the office window, the sky had darkened, the gray light of late afternoon giving way to evening, and with it came a sense of finality, not an ending but a transition. When the copies were ready, he handed them to me in a neat stack, secured with a simple clip. "If you need anything else," he began, but I shook my head gently. "I will let you know," I said, rising from the chair with the same calm precision I had carried with me since I walked out of that house. I thanked him quietly and turned toward the door. The hallway felt different on the way out, shorter somehow, more direct, as if the path had already been decided. When I stepped back into the lobby, the receptionist glanced up again, her eyes briefly searching my face, perhaps expecting to see grief or confusion or something undone, but I gave her a small, polite nod. Nothing more. Outside, the air was cooler. Now the kind that settles against your skin and reminds you that time is moving whether you are ready or not. I walked to my car without hesitation. The documents held securely in my hand, not clutched, not hidden, just carried. When I sat down behind the wheel, I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I placed the folder carefully on the passenger seat and looked at it for a moment. Then I looked ahead at the empty road stretching out in front of me. Earlier that day, I had been told to leave and never come back, as if my place in that house, in that family, had been something temporary, something borrowed, something that could be taken away with a single sentence. But now, sitting there in the quiet, with everything Robert had left behind laid out clearly in my reach, I understood something they did not. They believed they had control because they had spoken first, because they had acted quickly, because they had assumed I would break under the weight of loss and humiliation. But they had misunderstood one simple thing. They had mistaken silence for surrender, and that was a mistake they were going to regret. That night, I did not go back to the house. I drove instead to a small extended stay hotel on the edge of town. The kind of place with neutral walls and quiet hallways where no one asks questions and no one expects explanations. I checked in with a simple smile, gave my name, and accepted the key card without hesitation, as if this had been planned all along. The room was modest but clean: a bed, a small kitchen area, a table by the window, nothing personal, nothing tied to memory, and for the first time in days that felt like a relief, I set my purse down on the table and placed the folder from the bank beside it, aligning the edges carefully, the way Robert used to do with his documents. Then I sat down and looked at it again, not because I had missed anything, but because I wanted to feel the certainty of it settle deeper. Each page was a piece of something larger, something deliberate, and the more I reviewed it, the clearer it became that Robert had not simply prepared for his absence. He had anticipated resistance, manipulation, even betrayal, and he had built safeguards that would not fail easily. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a slow breath, not of relief but of understanding. Earlier that day, I had been asked to leave as if I had no claim, no authority, no place, but the documents in front of me told a different story, one that had not yet been spoken out loud, one that Jessica and Daniel clearly did not know. I reached for my phone and glanced at the screen. There were no messages, no missed calls, nothing from either of them, and that silence did not surprise me. If anything, it confirmed what I had already seen at the table. I was no longer someone they felt the need to consider, and that was exactly why they had underestimated me. I set the phone down and stood up, walking slowly toward the window outside. The parking lot was quiet, a few cars scattered under the dim lights, the sky now fully dark. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, and for a moment I allowed myself to think back, not to the pain of that evening but to the days before it, the small things that had begun to shift even before Robert passed. Jessica taking control of conversations, speaking over me in subtle ways, Daniel agreeing too quickly, avoiding eye contact, decisions being made without including me, changes that at the time felt like adjustments, like the natural evolution of a household, but now in this quiet room they formed a pattern, one that was no longer easy to ignore. I closed my eyes briefly, letting those pieces fall into place, not forcing them, just allowing them to connect. When I opened my eyes again, the hesitation that might have been there before was gone, replaced by something far more stable. I walked back to the table and picked up the folder, opening it once more, this time turning directly to the section that had stood out the most, the clause that defined ownership, authority, and the conditions tied to both. I read it slowly, word for word, not rushing, not skipping ahead, just absorbing the structure of it, the clarity, the intent, and as I did, a faint smile touched my lips, not out of satisfaction but out of recognition. Robert had known exactly what he was doing, and more importantly, he had trusted me to see it through. I closed the folder again and reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in some time: Emily Carter, an old friend, but more than that, a real estate attorney with a reputation for precision and discretion. I hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button. The line rang twice before she answered, her voice warm but alert. "Margaret, it has been a while," she said, and I could hear the curiosity beneath her tone. I did not waste time with small talk. "I need your help reviewing some documents," I said, my voice calm, direct, "and I need to move quickly." There was a brief pause on the other end, not of confusion but of consideration. "Tomorrow morning," she replied. 9 o'clock, my office. I nodded even though she could not see me. "Thank you," I said simply, ending the call without adding anything unnecessary. I placed the phone back on the table and sat down again. The plan was not fully formed yet, but the direction was clear. I was not going to confront them. Not yet. I was not going to argue. explain or demand anything that would have given them time to adjust, to prepare, to protect themselves, and I had no intention of offering that advantage. Instead, I would let them continue exactly as they were, comfortable in their assumptions, confident in their control, unaware of what had already shifted. I reached into my purse and pulled out my keys, turning them slowly in my hand, the familiar weight grounding me. Earlier that day, those keys had felt like something I was being forced to give up, a symbol of a life I was being pushed out of, but now they felt different, not because they had changed, but because I set them down beside the folder and looked at both for a moment. Then I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into a softer light. And as I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, I did not think about what I had lost. I thought about what was still mine and, more importantly, what they had no idea they were about to lose. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm, the room still dim with early light filtering through the curtains, and for a brief moment I forgot where I was, the unfamiliar ceiling above me, the quiet that did not belong to my home. Then it returned, not as a shock, but as a steady awareness. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor, grounding myself in the present. There was no hesitation in my movements, no lingering confusion, only a quiet sense of direction. I walked to the small kitchen area and made a cup of coffee, the routine simple, familiar, the smell filling the space in a way that felt almost comforting. I carried the cup back to the table and sat down. The folder still exactly where I had left it, untouched, waiting. I did not open it right away. Instead, I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle, and allowed my thoughts to move through the past with more clarity than they had the night before. I began to see not just moments, but patterns. Jessica had not changed overnight, her confidence, her control, the way she positioned herself in every conversation. It had all been there, subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Daniel's silence had not started at that table either. It had grown over time, small decisions he no longer shared, conversations he avoided, a distance that I had once attributed to stress, to adulthood, to life moving forward. But now, in the quiet light of morning, those explanations no longer held. I set the cup down gently and reached for the folder, opening it with the same measured care. Turning again to the sections that mattered most, I traced a line of text with my finger, not because I needed help reading it, but because I wanted to feel the certainty of it. The structure Robert had put in place was not just protective, it was strategic. There were timelines, conditions that required transparency, clauses that activated under specific circumstances. And as I followed them, step by step, I realized something that made me pause. This was not simply about ensuring I would be taken care of. It was about accountability, about making sure that anyone who tried to bypass that structure would expose themselves in the process. I leaned back slightly, absorbing that realization. Robert had not left anything to chance. He had created a system that required honesty to function smoothly, and if honesty was absent, the consequences would not need to be forced, they would unfold on their own. I closed the folder again and checked the time. It was just past 8 o'clock, enough time to get ready and arrive at Emily's office without rushing. I stood up and moved with quiet efficiency, dressing in a simple navy blouse and a gray coat. Nothing that drew attention, nothing that suggested anything unusual, just the appearance of an ordinary morning. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the kind that wakes you fully. I got into my car and drove through the familiar streets of the town I had lived in for decades. Everything looked the same coffee shop on the corner, the same trees lining the sidewalks, the same houses with their neatly kept lawns, and yet, it all felt slightly different, not because it had changed, but because I had. When I arrived at Emily's office, she was already waiting, standing near the window with a file in her hand. She greeted me with a firm, reassuring look, one that did not ask questions, but understood the weight of why I was there. I handed her the folder without explanation, and she began reviewing it immediately, her eyes moving quickly but carefully across each page. There was no need for me to speak. The document spoke clearly enough. I watched her expression as she read, the subtle shifts, the moments where she paused slightly longer, and when she finally looked up at me, there was no surprise in her face, only confirmation. "This is very well constructed," she said, her voice calm but precise, "and very difficult to challenge if executed correctly." I nodded once. That was all I needed to hear. "Then we will execute it correctly," I replied, my tone steady. Without hesitation, she gave a small, knowing nod in return, already understanding that this was not about emotion, not about confrontation, but about timing, precision and control. And as I sat there across from her, I felt the final piece fall into place, not a rush of victory, not relief, but a quiet certainty that everything was now moving exactly as it should. We did not rush the process. Emily insisted on that from the very beginning, not because there was uncertainty, but because precision required patience, and patience, in this case, would become our greatest advantage. I sat across from her as she organized the documents into a new structure, separating what needed to be filed immediately from what needed to remain quiet for now. Every movement she made was deliberate, each page placed exactly where it belonged, and as I watched, I realized that this was not just about protecting what Robert had left behind, it was about allowing the truth to reveal itself without interference. "They will act soon," Emily said without looking up, her voice calm, certain. "People who believe they have control tend to move quickly, especially when they think no one is watching." I nodded slightly because I had already seen that pattern begin. Jessica's confidence at the table had not come from nowhere. It had been building, reinforced by the absence of resistance, by Daniel's silence, by my own willingness until now to let things pass without confrontation. But that phase was over, not with a confrontation, not with raised voices, but with a shift they could not yet see. "What do you expect them to do?" I asked, not out of doubt, but to hear it said out loud. Emily finally looked up, meeting my eyes with a steady expression. "They will try to formalize what they believe is already theirs," she said. "That means paperwork, transfers, possibly a sale, something that turns assumption into action." I let that settle, picturing it clearly: Jessica organizing documents, speaking with confidence, presenting herself as someone who had already taken control, Daniel standing beside her, not questioning, not hesitating, simply following. The image was not difficult to imagine. I had seen enough to know how it would unfold. "Then we let them," I said quietly, and Emily gave a small, approving nod. "Exactly," she replied. "Because once they act, the conditions your husband set become active. And at that point, everything changes." I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of that moment not as pressure, but as alignment. The plan was not about stopping them before they moved. It was about allowing them to move far enough that they could not step back, far enough that the structure Robert had built would respond on its own. "There is one more thing," Emily added, reaching for a separate document. "You will need to appear cooperative, not resistant, if they reach out. You do not argue, you do not question, you agree calmly." I almost smiled at that, not because it was unexpected, but because it matched exactly what I had already decided. Silence had brought me this far, and it would carry me further. "I understand," I said, taking the document from her and placing it with the others. When I left her office, the sun was higher now, the streets busier, people moving through their day without any awareness of the quiet shift that had just taken place. I walked to my car with the same steady pace, unlocked the door, and sat down behind the wheel. For a moment I did nothing, just sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, letting everything settle into place. Then my phone buzzed softly in my purse, the sound breaking the silence without urgency. I reached for it and looked at the screen. Daniel's name appeared, simple, familiar, unchanged. I stared at it for a second before answering, not quickly, not slowly, just at the right moment. "Mom." His voice came through, hesitant, almost careful, as if he was unsure which version of me would respond. "Where are you?" he asked, the question simple, but the tone carried something underneath. Not concern, not quite, more like uncertainty. I leaned back slightly in the seat, my voice calm when I spoke. "I am staying somewhere for now," I said, offering nothing more than what was necessary. There was a brief pause on the line, then he continued. "Jessica and I were thinking, maybe it is best if you take some time, to adjust." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, not in frustration but in acknowledgement. They were already moving, just as Emily had predicted, shaping the situation into something that suited them, presenting it as concern, as practicality, as if this had always been the natural outcome. "That sounds reasonable," I replied, my tone even. Without resistance. I could almost hear the shift in his breathing, the subtle release of tension, the confirmation he had been waiting for. "Okay," he said, a little more firmly now. "We will take care of things here. Do not worry about anything." "Do not worry," I repeated silently, the phrase settling in my mind with a quiet clarity. "Of course," I said, and ended the call without adding anything else. I placed the phone back in my purse and started the engine, pulling out of the parking space with steady hands as I drove. I did not feel anger, I did not feel urgency. I felt something far more controlled. They believed they were taking care of things, they believed they were moving forward without resistance, and that belief was exactly what would lead them where they needed to go. Not where they intended, but where the truth would meet them, and this time when it did, there would be no silence waiting on the other side. Over the next 2 days, I did exactly what they expected me to do, and nothing more. I stayed quiet, I stayed out of sight, and I gave them space to believe that everything was unfolding according to their plan. Each morning I followed the same routine, waking early, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, reviewing the documents not because I needed to, but because repetition sharpened clarity. Every clause, every condition became more familiar, more precise, until there was no uncertainty left, only timing. I did not call Daniel, I did not ask questions, and when he sent a brief message on the second evening, telling me that they were handling things at the house, I responded with a simple acknowledgement, nothing more, no curiosity, no resistance, just enough to keep the surface calm, and beneath that calm, I could feel the movement, subtle but steady, like a current building beneath still water. On the third morning Emily called, her voice direct as always. "They have started," she said without preamble. I did not ask how she knew, I did not need to. Information moves quickly when people act with confidence and without caution. "What have they done?" I asked, my tone even. She paused briefly, as if choosing the order in which to present it. "They have initiated contact with a listing agent," she said. "And there are early discussions about transferring certain accounts into joint control." I closed my eyes for a moment, not in surprise but in recognition. It was exactly as expected, the assumption of ownership turning into visible action. "Have they signed anything?" I asked, and she replied immediately, "Not yet, but they are moving in that direction, and quickly." I nodded slowly, even though she could not see me. Quick decisions often come with overlooked details, and overlooked details were exactly where Robert's structure would begin to respond. "Then we continue as planned," I said, and Emily's tone softened slightly, not with emotion but with agreement. "Yes," she said. "We let them commit." After the call ended, I remained seated at the table, my hands resting lightly on the surface, the room around me quiet, unchanged, and yet everything outside of it was shifting. I imagined Jessica walking through the house with a sense of authority, making calls, organizing meetings, speaking with the kind of certainty that comes from believing the outcome is already secured. I imagined Daniel beside her, nodding, agreeing, stepping into a role he had not fully questioned, and for a moment, I wondered if he understood what he was doing, not in terms of legality, but in terms of consequence. Then I let that thought go. Understanding was not required for consequence to take effect. Only action was. Later that afternoon, I drove past the house, not stopping, not slowing down, just passing by on the street as if I had somewhere else to be. From the outside, everything looked the same, the curtains drawn just as I had left them, the garden still neatly kept, the mailbox standing at the edge of the driveway, unchanged. But there was a subtle difference. A car I did not recognize parked near the curb, a small sign leaning against the garage wall, not yet placed but ready. I did not need to read it to know what it was. I kept driving, my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes forward. The moment for confrontation was not now. It was not on the street, not in front of a sign. It would come later, in a place where words carried weight and actions could not be undone. That evening, back in the quiet of the hotel room, I placed the keys on the table again, next to the folder, and looked at them both for a long moment. Earlier in the week, they had represented something I was being pushed away from, something I was expected to surrender. But now they represented something else entirely, a point of return, not to reclaim what was mine, but to reveal what had never been theirs. I turned off the light and sat in the dim glow from the window, the city outside moving in its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet conclusion approaching. They were moving quickly, just as we expected, and with every step they took, they were bringing themselves closer to a line they did not see, a line that, once crossed, would leave no room for explanation, no space for reversal, only the truth waiting exactly where it had been placed, long before any of this began. On the fourth day they called again, but this time it was not a simple check-in, not a casual message meant to maintain the illusion of concern. It was more direct, more structured, the kind of call that comes when a decision has already been made and all that remains is to make it sound reasonable. I answered after the second ring, my voice calm, measured, unchanged. "Mom," Daniel began, his tone more confident than before, as if he had rehearsed what he was about to say. "We have been talking with someone about the house." I did not interrupt him. I let the sentence finish, let him settle into the role he had chosen. "It might be a good time to sell, simplify things for everyone." Simplify, I repeated silently, the word placed carefully, designed to sound considerate, practical, even helpful. I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking at the wall across from me, saying nothing for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for him to fill it. "And we were thinking," he continued, "once it sells we can make arrangements for you, something comfortable, something easier to manage." I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration but in acknowledgement of how far they had already gone. Arrangements easier to manage, each phrase built on the assumption that I was no longer part of the decision, only the outcome. That sounds like a plan you have already decided on, I said finally, my voice even without accusation. There was a slight pause on the other end, then Jessica's voice entered the call, clear, composed, confident. We just want what is best for everyone, she said, her tone smooth, practiced. And we thought it would be easier if we handled the process. Easier again, the same pattern, the same structure, decisions made in advance, presented as thoughtful consideration. I let another brief silence pass, then nodded even though they could not see me. If that is what you think is best, I replied, my voice soft but steady, and in that moment, I could almost feel the shift on their side of the call, the subtle release of tension, the confirmation they had been waiting for, compliance, agreement, no resistance. Great, Daniel said quickly, relief clear in his tone. We will move forward then, we will keep you updated. Keep me updated, I thought. As if I were a distant relative, not the person who had lived in that house longer than either of them. Of course, I said, and ended the call before anything else could be added. I placed the phone down gently and sat there for a moment, the room quiet around me, unchanged, steady, and yet everything outside of it had just moved one step further. They were no longer testing the idea, they were acting on it, formalizing it, moving from conversation to execution. I reached for the folder and opened it again, turning directly to the sections Emily and I had marked. The conditions were clear, specific actions would trigger specific responses, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably, like a sequence already set in motion. I traced the line again with my finger, feeling the certainty of it, then closed the folder and stood up, walking to the window outside. The afternoon light stretched across the parking lot. The same quiet scene as before, nothing out of place, nothing urgent, and yet I knew that somewhere across town, contracts were being discussed, timelines being outlined, signatures being prepared, and with each step they took, they were aligning themselves with something they did not yet understand. Later that evening, Emily called again, her tone steady, precise. They have scheduled a preliminary meeting with the agent and a financial advisor, she said. They are moving faster than expected. I nodded slightly, absorbing the information without surprise. That works in our favor, I replied, and she agreed without hesitation. Yes, it does. There was a brief pause, then she added. Once they formalize any transfer attempt, the clause activates fully. There will be no ambiguity at that point. No ambiguity, that was what mattered, not interpretation, not argument, just clarity. I thanked her and ended the call. Placing the phone beside the folder once more, I sat down slowly, folding my hands in front of me. Everything was now exactly where it needed to be. They believed they were moving toward control, toward ownership, toward a future they had already imagined, but what they did not see was the line just ahead of them, quiet, invisible, but absolute, and once they crossed it, there would be no need for confrontation, no need for raised voices or explanations, only the truth waiting patiently, ready to meet them the moment they stepped into it. The call came the following afternoon, not from Daniel this time, but from a number I did not recognize. I let it ring once, twice, then answered with the same calm I had carried through the past few days. Mrs. Hayes? A man's voice said, professional, measured. This is Michael Turner. I am the listing agent working with your family regarding the property on Willow Creek Drive. I did not respond immediately. I let him continue, giving him the space to explain what he believed was already agreed upon. We are preparing to move forward with the listing, and I was told you are the current occupant on record, so I just need to confirm a few details before we proceed. Confirm, I repeated silently, the word carefully chosen, built on the assumption that the decision itself was already settled. I shifted slightly in my seat, my eyes resting on the folder in front of me. What details do you need? I asked, my tone neutral, inviting him to continue without resistance. He paused briefly, then spoke again. Just confirmation that you are aware of the sale process and that you consent to vacate the property within the expected timeline. There it was, spoken clearly now, not just a plan but an action being formalized. I allowed a small pause to settle between us, not long enough to raise concern, but long enough to acknowledge the weight of what he had said. I understand, I replied, my voice even, and in that moment, I could almost feel the shift on the other end of the line, the quiet assumption that everything was proceeding smoothly, exactly as expected. Perfect, he said, a note of satisfaction entering his tone. We will move forward with the listing this week, and I will coordinate with Daniel and Jessica regarding next steps. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me. That sounds fine, I said, and ended the call without adding anything more. I placed the phone down gently and sat still for a moment, the room quiet around me, unchanged, and yet something had just crossed the line, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. They had moved from intention to execution, from assumption to action, and in doing so they had activated something they did not yet see. I reached for the folder and opened it, turning directly to the clause that Emily and I had reviewed so carefully, my finger tracing the line once more, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to feel the exact point where everything shifted. The language was clear, precise, and now no longer theoretical. I closed the folder slowly and stood up, walking toward the window outside. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, everything appearing calm, ordinary, unchanged, and yet beneath that surface, the structure Robert had built was now fully engaged. Later that evening, I met Emily at her office again, the atmosphere quieter than before, more focused, as if both of us understood that this was no longer preparation, this was execution. She had already laid out several documents on the table when I arrived, each one aligned, each one ready. They have initiated the listing, she said without preamble, her voice calm but precise, and based on the information we have, they have represented themselves as having authority to proceed. I nodded once, taking a seat across from her, my hands resting lightly on the table. Then the condition is met, I said, not as a question, but as a statement. She met my gaze directly, her expression steady. Yes, she replied. It is fully active now. There was no need for further explanation, no need to go over what we had already reviewed. Everything had been set in motion long before. This moment, all that remained was to follow through. What is the next step? I asked, my tone even, controlled. Emily reached for one of the documents and slid it toward me. We file this first, she said. It establishes your legal position and halts any unauthorized transfer immediately. I looked down at the page, scanning the text, not rushing, not hesitating, just absorbing the structure of it. Then I picked up the pen she had placed beside it and signed my name with a steady hand, the ink settling into the paper without hesitation, without doubt. Emily took the document back and placed it with the others, already moving to the next step. Once this is filed, she continued, any further action on their part will not only be invalid, it will be documented as a direct violation. Violation, the word landed quietly, not harsh, not dramatic, just exact. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the moment settle. This was not about stopping them anymore. It was about allowing their actions to be seen for what they were, clearly, undeniably, without interpretation. Then we let them continue, I said, and Emily gave a small, knowing nod. Yes, she replied. We let them finish what they started. When I left her office that evening, the air outside felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, as if something that had been building quietly had finally reached its point of definition. I walked to my car with the same steady pace, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, but inside everything was aligned. They believed they were moving toward a future they had already claimed, but in reality, they had just stepped into the very structure that would take that claim away from them. And this time, when the truth surfaced, it would not be subtle. It would not be something they could dismiss or explain away. It would stand in front of them, complete, undeniable, and entirely of their own making. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at 10 o'clock. A neutral office downtown where paperwork was signed and decisions were made official. Emily had arranged everything with quiet precision, and when I arrived, she was already there, seated at the table with a calm expression that mirrored my own. The room was simple, a long wooden table, a few chairs, a window overlooking the street below, nothing dramatic, nothing designed to intimidate, just a place where truth would be placed on paper. A few minutes later, Daniel and Jessica walked in together, their steps confident, their posture relaxed in a way that told me they believed they were here to finalize something they already owned. Jessica was the first to speak, her smile polite but distant. Margaret, she said, as if addressing someone she barely knew. I inclined my head slightly, offering nothing more than acknowledgement. Daniel avoided my eyes at first, then glanced up briefly, his expression uncertain for a fraction of a second before settling back into something more controlled. They took their seats across from us, and for a moment there was a quiet stillness in the room, the kind that comes just before something shifts. The agent, Mr. Turner, sat at the end of the table, organizing his documents, his tone professional as he began outlining the process, the listing, the expected timeline, the steps that would follow once the property was officially placed on the market. Jessica nodded along, occasionally adding small confirmations, reinforcing the narrative that everything was already agreed upon, that this was simply the final step. Daniel remained mostly silent. His hands folded in front of him, his gaze fixed somewhere between the table and the documents, and I watched him, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity. When Mr. Turner finished, he turned toward me, his expression polite, expectant. "Mrs. Hayes, we just need your signature here to confirm your agreement to proceed," he said, sliding the document toward me, the paper stopping just within reach of my hand. I looked down at it, not rushing, not reacting, just observing. The language was exactly as expected, structured to move everything forward under the assumption of shared consent. I let a small silence settle over the table, long enough for Jessica to shift slightly in her chair, her confidence still intact, but now accompanied by a hint of impatience. "It is standard," she said, her tone smooth, reassuring. "Just a formality so we can move ahead." I lifted my eyes slowly, meeting hers, and for the first time since that evening at the dining table, I allowed myself to hold her gaze without looking away, not with confrontation, not with emotion, but with something far more steady, recognition. Then I reached into my bag and placed a different set of documents on the table, aligning them carefully in front of me before sliding them toward the center. Emily did not speak, she did not need to. The shift in the room was immediate, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Mr. Turner paused, his hand hovering slightly above his own paperwork, his attention drawn to what I had just introduced. Jessica's expression tightened just enough to reveal that something was no longer following the path she had expected. "Before we proceed," I said, my voice calm, even, "there is something that needs to be clarified." I turned the top page toward them, my finger resting lightly on a single line of text, the same line I had read so many times over the past few days, the same line that had remained quiet until now. "This property," I continued, my tone steady, "is not subject to transfer under the conditions currently being assumed." There was a brief silence, not confusion, not yet, but a pause in momentum, a moment where the structure they believed in hesitated. Mr. Turner leaned forward slightly, scanning the document, his expression shifting from routine professionalism to focused attention. Jessica's confidence did not disappear, but it faltered just enough to be seen. "What is this?" she asked, her voice controlled but no longer as smooth as before. I did not raise my voice, I did not rush to explain, I simply allowed the document to speak, allowed the structure Robert had put in place to reveal itself in its own time, line by line, condition by condition. Emily spoke then, her tone precise, measured. "The property is held under a protected arrangement," she said. "Any attempt to transfer, list, or reassign ownership without full compliance with the outlined conditions triggers an automatic suspension and review." Mr. Turner's posture shifted as he read further, his earlier confidence replaced by careful consideration. "I was not made aware of this," he said slowly, his voice no longer certain, and that was the moment everything changed, not with a dramatic reaction, not with raised voices, but with the quiet collapse of an assumption. Jessica leaned forward, her eyes moving quickly across the page, searching for something that would restore control, something that would return the situation to what she believed it was. But the more she read, the more that control slipped, not abruptly, not violently, but steadily. Daniel finally looked up, really looked, his gaze moving from the document to me, and in that moment, there was no distance left, only realization. I sat there without moving, my hands resting calmly on the table, my expression unchanged. I did not need to say anything more. The truth was already there, fully present, fully clear, and entirely beyond negotiation. After a long silence, I spoke again, my voice quiet but firm. "This was never your decision to make," I said, not as an accusation, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. The room remained still, the weight of those words settling into every corner, and for the first time since that evening, it was not me who had been removed from the table, it was the illusion they had built, and there was nothing left to hold it in place.